Right, gentlemen, I am going to tell you today about a trip that I had a few weeks ago. And the reason why I'm going to tell you about this trip is because I think there's a lot of value to be found in it. I have found that the experience that we're going to be talking about today is something that's really changed my perspective on some things. So, as a man who doesn't drink wine but is totally in touch with the importance of vintage style, I've got a glass of wine with me today because I think this is one of those where it requires a bit of a swirl on thought. So I'm going to channel my inner aristocrat today as I talk about my bombastic hedonistic behaviours. It's about 12 at night and I'm feeling pretty relaxed, and I wanted to talk about this trip today because I think, to be honest, I think there's a lot of value to be found in what it is that I'm going to sort of expose about what came of this. So first of all, the trip that I went into a few weeks ago, those who haven't yet figured this out, this is a psychedelic trip. Going into the trip, I didn't have much in the way of expectation. I wanted to go and sort of parlay and explore and see what came of it because I wasn't in the best frame of mind. I was coming into the trip thinking quite a lot of negative thoughts towards myself, and I wanted to see whether, as is sometimes the case, the best thing to do is to burrow into the emotion rather than sort of hiding away from it or trying to even sort of self-improvement your way through it. I thought, why don't I actually sit with this thought and see what comes of it? So I did. So, the plan of action for the night, let's set the scene. Plan of action was, I was sat in my room, I had my nebula light, which is like starry shit, on the ceiling, and I put my dressing gown on, it was nice and relaxed, and I dosed up. As I dosed up, I put some peaceful piano on because I thought I need something to sort of ground me in, like a feeling, like something to sort of guide the thought, and I thought something nice and positive and relaxed and instigating of thought. So I started my trip, and before long I came to this sort of really tranquil state of mind. It was almost as though the sort of chaotic state of the despotic nature of my mind had somewhat ceased to exist, and things felt much more peaceful. I all of a sudden felt like the race to sort of how would I put it? This sort of constant sense of putting myself on the clock and watching and always being sort of just judgmental, all of a sudden started to fall away. And I sat with my thoughts for a few minutes here and really started to burrow into this idea of essentially the fact that I had spent so much time just basically talking shit to myself, about myself, for myself. And as you can probably imagine, given the sort of ludicrousy of that lunacy, I suppose, of that sentence, it very quickly became sort of aware. I very quickly became aware of the fact that what I was doing to myself was absolutely fucking stupid. You know, I was really putting myself through the ringer on this. I was feeling so negative about sort of, I'd do something nice for someone, I'd be a good person, do something good, and then I'd beat myself up about it, feeling that all of a sudden, you know, or for whatever reason, I'd done it to try and gain an angle on someone or something like that. And I was really, you know, my thoughts towards myself were not very good in this moment. And all of a sudden, as I say, I started to sort of peel that away and realise that, you know, I am actually human. And I'm allowed to do things, I'm allowed to make mistakes. And even one step further, I'm seeing myself making mistakes in places that I'm not making mistakes. You know, I was really ridiculing myself, giving myself a hard time for some stuff that I thought, this is not warranted. You know, the sort of pain that I'm putting myself through here is not embedded in a progressive sense of mind. It is just chastising. So I came to terms with the fact that my trains of thought were significantly worse than they should have been, at which point I decided that the port of call, the most important thing for me to do at this point, was to really sit with this emotion. So I dosed up again, At which point I felt the compulsion to sit on my back with my hands just like that, and just sit and really relax, really sort of burrow into the experience. So I did that, and I sat and I listened to this music, and this music was getting ever more swelling to the thought of sort of acceptance within the self. I was becoming more and more aware of the fact that I had spent so much time in this frame of mind without even realising that I was there. You know, I'd spent so much time trying to sort of police my way into being a better person, and as a result of that I'd turn myself into a worse person because I wasn't being kind to myself. And as a result of doing that, I came to realise something that I think is really important, and is essentially the lesson that I took away from this, is you should never apologise for being yourself. And this is something that I have done ad nauseum. I'd been very ridiculing of myself to a point where I wasn't myself. You know, I was a caricature in many respects. I hadn't actually afforded anyone the sort of privilege of actually knowing me because I'd guarded myself. And as a result of that, I came to realise something closer to the heart. And that was that I am essentially a people pleaser. In every sense of the word, my desires are embedded in a sort of the hope to make as many people around me as possible happy. Now, when you hear that, you will understand quite quickly that that's not a bad thing by any stretch of the imagination. But it is something that was starting to become pernicious because I wasn't actually myself. And what I mean by that is, in an attempt to make sure I didn't upset anyone, I was sort of blocking out my character as to not show any parts of myself that would be potentially, how should I put it, sort of just characteristic, you know, like let me put it into layman's terms for you. Dave Chappelle is a fucking legend, and he is a legend because he's himself. And there's no one quite like Dave. He's a very particular character that, as a result of his sort of esoteric nature, is dividing. It's very much the sort of Marmite flavour of person where it's like you either love them or you hate them. And my state of mind was taking me closer and closer towards this sort of banal existence in which I didn't provide anyone with a sort of flavour of my character for fear of the fact that they might not like it. Now, of course, to the point that we have just made there with this sort of Marmite Dave Chappelle, is you don't allow the people who would like you, the good parts of you, the people that connect with that part of you, you don't allow anyone to experience that. Or I wasn't allowing anyone to experience that because I was so bogged down in this sense of sort of hope to not hurt. At which point, you can probably imagine that the trip was starting to get closer and closer to a sort of ethereal sense of sort of the psychedelic trip. Like, it was really starting to get to the sort of all the hallmarks of the psychedelic thought, the sort of oneness and everything and nothing type thoughts were starting to come into play. At which point, as I say, for context, I'm now still sat looking pretty relaxed with the nebula star going on the roof and a certain substance coursing through my veins with some real willpower at this point. And I tell you what, I think one of the most important lessons that I took from this, probably the most important lesson actually when I think about it, was to not take myself so seriously. I all of a sudden came to this point where it's like I've been trying so hard to become the best version of myself and do as much as I can to sort of progress that I'd really sort of lost touch with what the actual sort of name of the game was. If you know what I mean, where I was trying to optimise and trying to grow and trying to improve to such an extent that I was really sort of just doing the opposite, I suppose. I wasn't actually allowing myself any time to just express my own character and just be myself. I almost felt as though I couldn't be myself until I'd sort of proved myself. I very much, as I've spoken about in a few videos recently, sort of voiced the thought to myself that I could only be who I am through my work. You know, I wasn't Tom. I was Tom who is only good because he'd done enough work today. And I came closer to sort of thinking about that and really looking and thinking, you know, what am I talking about here? What am I doing in this sort of, with this mind that is constantly asking of you to just prove yourself to yourself? You know, what is going on here? And I realised in that moment, when I sat there just really fucking relaxed, really pretty quite relaxed, wine break. Oh, that's why I don't drink wine. I'm just going to keep it as aesthetic. Ah, going to keep it as aesthetic, no more. I came to a point in my relaxation that I just didn't need to be so serious. You know, I'd been trying so hard to create something, to look for, you know, the reason as to why I'd wanted to become better at things was so that I was better for other people. I wanted to get to a point where I was funnier or kinder or just generally a better person to be around. And as a result of doing that, I was actually moving further and further away from some of my more authentic qualities. You know, things that are from the heart. You don't self-improvement your way to being a good, sort of kind person in that sense, I suppose. And I just really came to a point where I understood that I don't need to be so harsh on myself. And that's a lesson that I would take and provide for a lot of people, is we do think that we've got to be a lot more serious than we have to be. You know, I notice in myself that my plan of action for sort of achieving something is so likely to follow the rhythm of sort of, how can I work my way towards this? And it's like, sometimes you don't. Sometimes the best thing for you to do is not work your way towards things. It's not to optimize your way towards it. It's just to be yourself and to relax. And to relax, that's the thing. The experience in question, I'm going to leave the substance itself out of this in case it's red flagging for anyone, but the psychedelic substance itself is renowned for making you very relaxed and sort of lacking control, I suppose, in your bodily senses. And it was funny because I came to a point with this where I realised that I had a lot more control than I thought I did. You know, I was trying so hard to create control through these optimised routines and systems that made me more charismatic or better at this or, you know, whatever. And as a result of that, I was drifting further and further away from the control that I actually knew I had. And that control was the fact that a lot of the time, the best thing you can do is just be yourself and relax. You know, if a good example that I should push, that is something I'm learning at the moment, but it is certainly working, you know, my efforts at the moment are being fruitful, is with women. I spent a long time thinking that the best way to sort of go about the dating scene was to charisma your way to what you're looking for. And I did it in a way that was sort of so set up and so by the book and so just sanitized that I was really missing the mark when it came to the fact that women, when you approach them, actually just want you to be nice, funny, interesting to talk to, like nothing that's hard to do. And I suppose that acts as some form of, what would the word be? Sort of, it's like indicative of the rest of the scene with my life, was that I was trying to work for things that you don't need to work for. You don't need to work to become more relaxed. You just need to relax. And I suppose I'm going to branch on to a different point here of why I think trips are important, why I think there is use to having trips. Now, I'm not going to condone, and I shall caveat that there are extenuating circumstances here that require you to do your own research before you do these things. I would never tell anyone to do psychedelics before doing your own research, of course, because there can, I've had my own experiences that have been pretty harrowing, and without sort of the pre-understanding of the fact that might happen and being able to reframe that because of that information, I'm not quite sure I would have been able to deal with it as well as I did. But I shall say that in terms of understanding your mind, I don't think I've ever found anything that sort of brings you to that point better than psychedelics do. And my experience here is testament to that, because it was like a eureka moment where I realised all of a sudden that I couldn't continue being this unkind to myself, for one, and all of the things that I'm so desperately trying to sort of acquire are things that are not actually as hard as I think they are to get. I was going through a bit of like a lonely arc, to be honest, whilst this trip was going on, where I just felt pretty lonely. And as a result of that, I was thinking more and more that my way forth was just work your way to being undeniably sort of desirable. And this trip put me closer to the thought of, do you know what, actually, no, you can just relax. You can relax, and in doing so, you're probably going to get pretty close to where you want to go, because so much of our concern comes from when we're not relaxed. I was listening to a podcast with Malcolm Gladwell yesterday, and he was talking about the fact that he was talking to this policeman, and he said the most important thing for police to do when they're in a sort of stop and search or anything like that, an interaction, is to slow down time. Because when you slow down time, you allow yourself to really think about what's happening, and you don't get irrational. And I think that's a problem that we have so consistently with our lives, is we don't slow down to think. And this is where psychedelics can be pretty good, is they don't really allow you to sort of hide from your thoughts. You're there, and you're going to have to deal with the thought. And I think that's useful. I think there's really some pragmatism behind doing such things. And I think what I'm going to tie to this is I have spent quite a lot of time feeling bad about good things. And what I mean by that is the podcast is a great example. You shall notice today the relaxed element, the sort of almost lackadaisical nature of the podcast today is for a particular reason. It's because I want to actually realise within myself that what I'm doing with the whole project is something that I want to do. And I spent quite a long time recently sort of panicking and stressing and feeling uncomfortable about the whole podcasting ordeal, because it's quite nerve-wracking for me to talk to people. And on another front, it's so I care about it, I care about it so much that I want it to do well, and as a result of that, I'm scared of whether it will do well. And I came to realise recently, I was like, I'm putting myself in this position of sort of making the event feel arduous as to sort of signify its work value, if that makes sense. Well, let me clear that up a bit. I've made the podcast into more of an arduous task than it needs to be, because I find it important. Rather than looking at it and going, this is something I find important, so I'm going to have fun with it, I'm going to enjoy what it is that I'm doing. I'd gone the other way in it. And I think a lot of people do that, where you think you can make something that is otherwise very enjoyable, like sitting and having a conversation with your mates, be closer to sort of work because you're making it that way. There was a conversation that I had with a good friend of mine, Toby, last podcast we did. He's a great guy. And what was happening in that podcast was I was really exploring this thought of, you sort of when things go wrong, a lot of the time, why we feel bad about them going wrong is because of the story we tell ourselves. It's because we won't let ourselves get rid of feelings like guilt, where we'll just feel negative about what it is that we've done, to the point where we just beat ourselves up long enough that now we feel bad. I think it's the same thing when it comes to sort of good stuff. We can sort of, if you're working towards something that is making you better, you can fall into this trap of sort of thinking as though because it's hard, you need to feel bad about it. And that's not true. What I mean is, there's almost a glamour to being stressed. There's almost a glamour to being sort of in the midst of difficult work. And please be aware of the fact that you can do difficult work in a fun way. You know, this calls back to this idea of sort of not taking yourself too seriously, which is something I think more and more now people are doing, and certainly the man that is in front of you does, where you are just taking yourself so much more seriously than you need to. And I think when we can dial this back a bit and be more relaxed, be like base level first toke of cannabis, relaxed. When you can be in that frame of mind, the world runs a lot smoother for you. And that's a much better place to be in your head. It's much better when things are just dialed down a bit, taking away a bit of the sort of speed of things, I suppose. Don't do speed. Taking that away to the point where you're not feeling so rushed with things, and more sort of to tie a little bow on the point that we've made there, is to sort of be aware of the fact that when you do good things for yourself, that they don't need to be hard and saddening. You can do hard things that are good for you, and you can put them in a way that even if you are anxious about them, you can reframe that, or you should try and reframe that until this works, where you're excited. You know, for instance, if you are doing a podcast, then come on this podcast and we'll talk. If you are doing something like that for yourself, then enjoy it. As Rio Ferdinand says, just enjoy it, man. And there's a real point to be made there, young Rio. Just do it. And I think I'm going to round this video out by saying that for those of you who are listening to this was a clip from the podcast, so if you want to listen to the whole thing, it will be on the channel. If not, if you're just listening to the whole thing, then thank you very much for listening, because pretty fucking relaxed, I'm not gonna lie. You know, this has been really nice to just sit and shoot some breeze, and I shall do this more often, because as I said in this point, it's important that we enjoy things. It really is. It's important that we find ourselves in positions where, even if we're anxious, or even if we're nervous about things, even if we're sad about things, that we find a way to open ourselves up to enjoyment, because it is there. And on the point of sadness, if you are sad at the moment, trust me, it will be okay. And I love you all. So that's what I'm going to say for this video. Thank you very much for watching. I appreciate it. I'm not going to have any more of this because it's fucking horrible. In a bit.